administration, so he'll be familiar with that. But we really do have a limit on no-bid contracts any longer. Any contracts of $50,000 or more must be put out for bid unless they involve something like professional services where quality cannot be defined in objective terms.
Okay, we'll continue with this and rebuttals. Senator.
In fact, we do have no-bid contracts, and they should be eliminated altogether, and it doesn't matter the nature of the services. You can build in safeguards to take care of any of the questions of quality in the bidding process. What we actually passed a couple of years ago was a request for proposal statute, which doesn't tie the hands of state government and doesn't avail itself really of the marketplace's supply and demand ideas. So that's really where we have to go in terms of no-bid contracts. Mitch Daniels saved over $100 million by eliminating them in the state of Indiana. There's no reason we can't do that in the state of South Dakota and then reinvest those dollars in the priorities that matter for South Dakota, which is the future of our state, the children of our state.
All right, Lieutenant Governor, you do have time for a rebuttal.
I invite you to go to House Bill 1260. 2 years ago, Senator Heideprem's memory is faulty. It does address requests for proposals, but it very clearly limits no-bid contracts, very clearly. I invite you to go look for yourself. House Bill 1260 in the 2009 legislature.
All right, very good. We'll move on to the next question. Lieutenant Governor, you will begin with the answer. Educators are seeing a significant increase in class size across the state. Is this a concern for you, and how will you address this if you become governor?
Again, all these issues devolve to the local school board. The number of students in each class is dependent upon the numbers of teachers, and the numbers of teachers are decided by the school board and school administration. What the state needs to do is provide resources, and I'm interested in doing that. I want to do that. As I said, when we budget for South Dakota, I want to provide the first dollars in our budget to meet our funding formula obligations. And then there are areas of the budget where we cannot control. Medicaid is an example. And again, I remind everyone that the size of, or the share of our state government budget, our general fund budget, that's allocated to education has not fallen in dollar terms, it's grown. But that fraction has fallen because Medicaid has grown so fast. 113,000 South Dakotans are on Medicaid. It typically grows by about 2,000 a year. 2 years ago, it grew by 5,000. This last year, up through June, it grew by 6,000. And so we're continuing to see some growth in Medicaid claims that are simply out of our control. And as an elderly person who's frail goes into the nursing home, runs out of money, and that bill starts being presented in peer for payment, we can't choose whether or not we're going to spend it. We can't say we're allocating a specific percentage to education or to anybody else if we can't pay for that person's nursing home bill. They can't be put on the street.
All right, same question, and I will read it again. Educators are seeing a significant increase in class size across the state. Is this a concern for you, and how will you address this if you become governor?
Yes, it's a concern, and as I've said before, it's inconsistent to say you're concerned about it, but you aren't going to avail yourself of the resources to actually do something about it. We have the chance here in South Dakota to make a difference in the lives of children, to bring on 500 educators or to not dismiss 500 educators under that new federal act. But let's go back to the budget because the Lieutenant Governor wants to talk about Medicaid. Frankly, we don't do as good a job as we could in South Dakota in terms of the Medicaid caseload. Other states are well ahead of us in privatizing the way in which you handle the Medicaid caseload, reducing costs, introducing measures that save money in the way you handle Medicaid. I proposed a study in the 2007 session, which the Rounds-Dugard administration promptly killed, which would have examined the way in which we handle Medicaid and administer Medicaid in the state of South Dakota. But finally, to say that this is a result of the downturn in the economy is simply inaccurate. This administration has given us budgets with structural deficits in 7 of the last 8 years. There wasn't an economic downturn in 2008 or 7 or 6 or 5 or 4 or 3. And yet we had structural deficits, and we had failed to value education and educators at the same time we were growing the size of state government. That trend has simply got to be reversed. It cannot be sustained, and the future of South Dakota depends on it.
All right, we'll stay on the subject for rebuttals. Lieutenant Governor.
Well, it's not my duty to defend the budgetary practices of the Rounds administration, but I will talk about them. When Governor Rounds and I first took office, we faced a significant budget deficit because of the repeal of the inheritance tax. We've looked at $50 million in cuts that had to be made, and Governor Rounds, in order to maintain the funding and fulfill the funding formula for K-12 education, reduced that deficit down and used some reserves. In those years, in the year immediately following that, we received some federal funds, which we did bankroll, which we put in our reserve fund. And then we used those to moderate the effect of that loss of that tax revenue over a period of years. By 2006, we were in a budget surplus, and then the legislature made some revenue projections, which I would regard as unsound. I would have vetoed the 2008 and 2009 General Appropriations Bill and demanded a more responsible revenue estimate by the legislature.
Okay, we'll continue with rebuttal. Senator.
Well, the budget deficit situation is clear for anyone who wants to look at it. We've had structural deficits in 7 of the last 8 years. That is, the Rounds-Dugas administration cannot bring revenue and expenditures into sync. That's step one for logical management. That's what we have to do in South Dakota. But understand that in our state, we have gone through difficult situations, and we've adjusted by making the bureaucracy more resilient and smaller, by making government smarter, smaller, more accountable, and more transparent. In 1995, when Bill Janko took office for the 3rd time, he inherited a bureaucracy with 13,200 state employees. And 2 years later, he had reduced the size of government to 12,200 state employees. It can be done without reducing essential services. That doesn't include K-12 education. It can't include K-12 education. But we can do that, and we can use the revenue that we derive from those significant changes to reinvest in education.
Very good. This will be our last question, and again, all of tonight's questions were provided by education leaders who are in our audience tonight. Senator, you'll begin with the answer. Do you support the 100 student minimum district size currently in law, and as governor, would you veto legislation that required additional forced consolidation of school districts?
Thank you, Stephanie, and again, thank you everybody for being here. I absolutely do not support the 100 minimum students. In fact, it's one of the areas in the area of education where Senator Knutson and I actually disagreed quite strongly. I have seen absolutely no evidence to suggest to me that a smaller school is somehow inferior to a larger one. I just haven't seen the evidence of it, or that it's less efficient. I think about Condé, South Dakota, that wasn't even receiving any state aid, and we closed that school. We said to the patrons in that school district, you no longer have a legal right to have a school. We're going to close it, even though you are not an obligation of the state aid formula any longer. I just think that's a mistake, and it flies in the face to me of local control, of the importance of school board members, and the incredible job in South Dakota that school board members really do. You know, it's bad enough that on occasion, the administration has demagogued school board members, talking about any balances they might have, or if a balance is too much. I've sat through 4 State of the State messages from this administration and heard them demagogue school board members about the amount of savings they might have. And as I said to the governor once, if you want to run the school boards, run for the school board. But you're the governor of South Dakota. Let the school boards run themselves, and we'll be a lot better off if you do.
All right, same question, Lieutenant Governor. Do you support the 100 student minimum district size currently in law? And as governor, would you veto legislation that required additional forced consolidation of school districts?
I do not support the 100 student minimum, and I'm on record as saying so. I would support legislation that repealed that requirement. I think it should be up to parents and taxpayers and school board members of every school district to decide at what point they should or should not merge or consolidate or share teachers or share administrators or co-op for sports. I think that's local control. That's for them to decide. I'm also glad Senator Heideprim brought up the notion of limits on school district budget reserves. This is an area where I also disagree with the current policy. If I'm elected governor, I will bring legislation to repeal the requirement that budget reserves be limited by school districts and be spent down or they lose interest earnings on them.
All right. we'll continue on this subject with some rebuttal time. Senator.